The storm arrived without warning, the way trouble always does in summer. One moment, the August night was thick and breathless, the air above Harlem smelling of hot asphalt and frying fatback and someone's gardenia perfume drifting from an open window 3 floors up. Then the sky simply cracked open. Lightning split the darkness over 133rd Street, and the thunder that followed shook the teeth of every man, woman, and child still foolish enough to be caught outside. Inside the Velvet Queen, the lights flickered once, a long, slow, warning blink, like an eye half-closing in sleep, and then they went out entirely. Candles bloomed in the darkness like small orange flowers, held aloft by the waitstaff with the practiced ease of people who had navigated disaster before. The jazz quartet in the corner paused for just a moment, the trumpet player lowering his horn, and then they began again. Softer now, a low and mournful sound that seemed to belong to the storm. The rain hammered the windows, the candles threw shadows that moved like living things along the walls. And somewhere in the back of the club, behind a door marked private, something irreversible had already begun. The Velvet Queen was Loretta Beaumont's creation, and every inch of it bore her fingerprints. She had named herself Queenie before anyone else could name her something lesser, and the club reflected that same fierce act of self-definition. The burgundy velvet booths, the gold-leafed ceiling, the bar that ran the full length of the east wall and glittered even in candlelight like something from a dream. She had opened it in 1921 with borrowed money and iron will, and 7 years later there was not a soul in Harlem, nor in certain precincts of downtown Manhattan, who did not know the name. Tonight she had a full house and a full set of problems. At the bar, Solomon Vance nursed a glass of water, he never drank, and watched the room with the expression of a man calculating how much everything was worth. Beside the stage, young Cecily Holt stood in her silver-beaded dress, her lips moving silently through lyrics she would not get the chance to sing tonight. Near the back booth, half hidden by a velvet curtain, Augustine Cross wrote furiously in his leather notebook, ink-stained fingers flying across the page as though trying to outrun a thought. And at a corner table, alone and conspicuous, Vincent Caruso sat in his cream suit and smoked, watching the door to Queenie's office with the patience of a man who was used to being made to wait, and who had decided he was done waiting. It was Cecily who found her. The girl had slipped away from the main floor just before 11, intending to knock on Queenie's office door one last time, to plead her case one final time, to ask the woman who had made her to please not unmake her. The hallway behind the stage was narrow and dark, the candle she carried barely enough to see by. The office door was ajar. She pushed it open. Loretta Beaumont was seated in her chair behind the mahogany desk, her head tilted back slightly, her eyes closed, her expression almost peaceful, except that no one sleeps sitting upright in their own office at 11 o'clock at night with their hands folded in their lap, as though posed that way by careful, deliberate hands. On her chest, centered precisely over her heart, lay a single playing card, the Queen of Spades. Cecily opened her mouth. What came out was not a scream but something quieter and more terrible, a single sustained note, pure as grief, that cut through the jazz and the rain and the murmur of conversation and brought the entire room to silence. The storm answered with a crack of lightning that illuminated the office in blue-white light for one long frozen second. And in that second, everyone in the Velvet Queen saw the same thing. The Queen was dead. The back door was useless. 3 inches of rainwater had already flooded the alley, and the storm showed no sign of relenting. The front door opened onto 133rd Street, where the rain fell now in solid sheets, and the nearest police precinct was 15 minutes away on a dry night. Someone had already slipped out to find a telephone, but whether help would come in time to matter was another question entirely. It was Detective Cornelius Hayes who stepped forward. Not because anyone asked him to, but because he had spent 30 years reading rooms, and this room needed reading. He had come to the Velvet Queen tonight simply to leave an envelope for Queenie, an old debt of his own repaid in cash. He had not expected to find a dead woman and 5 suspects, and a storm sealing them all in together like insects in amber. He placed his badge on the bar where the candlelight caught it. He asked Solomon Vance to lock the front door and pocket the key. He asked the jazz quartet to put down their instruments. Then he walked to the office doorway, studied the body for a long and careful moment, crouched beside the desk, and noted three things that he kept entirely to himself. The card on her chest had been placed there with great deliberateness. No accident, no passion, but a statement. There was no glass on the desk, though Queenie was known to keep bourbon close. And on the floor, just beside the chair leg, a single blue ink smear marked the hardwood like a signature. Hayes gathered them at the bar. 6 candles burned between them, and the rain made its relentless argument against the windows, and nobody looked anybody else directly in the eye. Solomon Vance spoke first, because men who are used to managing situations cannot help themselves. He had been at the bar all evening, he said. 6 people had seen him. His voice was steady, and his hands were not. Cecily Holt wept quietly into a handkerchief and said she had only gone back to talk, just to talk. She had loved Queenie like a mother. The handkerchief, Hayes noted, was dry. Della Monroe leaned against the bar with her arms crossed and her jaw set and said she'd been running numbers collections on the east side until 9 and arrived at the club no more than 40 minutes ago. She had witnesses, she said, and the way she said it made clear she thought the question beneath her. Augustine Cross said very little. He sat at the far end of the bar with his notebook closed on the counter before him, and answered Hayes's questions in short, careful sentences, like a man arranging words he had already chosen. He had been writing all evening, he said, at his booth, alone. And Vincent Caruso, who had more reason than any of them to be careful, leaned back in his chair and smiled faintly and said that he was a legitimate businessman who had merely come uptown to discuss a real estate opportunity with Miss Beaumont, and that he would be saying nothing further without his attorney present. The Thunder agreed with him, with the suspects watched over by the club's broad-armed bartender, a man named Earl who had the look of someone who had seen everything twice. Hayes returned to the office alone. He worked by candlelight, which suited him. He had solved half his cases by candlelight. He found the bourbon first. Not on the desk where it always sat, but in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, still in its bottle, untouched. Queenie had not been drinking. She had put it away. That told Hayes she had been expecting someone she wanted to face with a clear head. Someone she did not entirely trust. He found the second thing under the corner of the desk blotter, a promissory note, handwritten, dated 3 days prior, for a sum that would have ruined a lesser person. The debtor's name was written in elegant script, Augustine Cross. The note was due the following Monday. He found the third thing tucked behind the small framed photograph of a woman who must have been Queenie's mother. A folded piece of paper with a single line written in blue ink, in a hand Hayes now recognized, a poet's hand, all flourish and intention. Some debts cannot be paid in money. He stood for a moment in the dark office with the rain against the window and the candle burning down, and the ghost of Loretta Beaumont somewhere in the room with him. Then he folded the note carefully and put it in his coat pocket. The red herring arrived, as they always do, dressed very convincingly as the truth. It was Solomon Vance who provided it, pulling Hayes aside with the urgent manner of a man who has decided that confession is the best form of deflection. He had lied about something, he said, not about where he was. That was true, he had been at the bar, but about why Caruso was there. He had arranged the meeting himself. He had been in private negotiation with Caruso's people for months. The plan was simple and terrible: sell a portion of the Velvet Queen to Caruso's operation, let the downtown money clean itself through the club's books, use the profits to go legitimate within 2 years. Queenie had found out that afternoon. She had been furious. She had threatened to go to the very police that both Caruso and Vance were trying to avoid. That gave Caruso motive, Vance said. That gave Caruso every reason. And then, as though to seal the case entirely, Earl the bartender appeared in the doorway and reported that he had found something in the men's washroom. A silk handkerchief, cream-colored, monogrammed with the initials VC, and on it a dark stain that looked very much like blood. Hayes looked at the handkerchief for a long time. He looked at the monogram. He thought about ink-stained fingers and a poet who chose his words with surgical precision. He set the handkerchief down on the bar with the deliberateness of a man refusing to be led. Hayes brought them all back to the main floor, to the largest table, the round one near the center of the room where Queenie had held court on ordinary nights. The candles had burned lower. The storm had not. He stood at the table's edge and looked at each of them in turn, letting the silence do its work. And it did, because silence always extracts more truth than questions if you are patient enough. He began with what everyone could agree on. Queenie was dead. The card on her chest was a message, not a clue. It was theatre, the act of someone who wanted the death to mean something beyond the death itself. He said that Caruso was many things, but not a theatrical man. Caruso's crimes were ledger items, not performances. Caruso's eyes went flat, but he said nothing. He said that Della Monroe had arrived too late, and the timeline held, her witnesses confirmed. Della uncrossed her arms, just slightly. He said that Solomon Vance had motive and opportunity and absolutely no nerve for it. A man who arranges meetings and keeps ledgers does not place playing cards on the chests of the women who built the thing he covets. Solomon looked stricken by the precision of this. He said that Cecily Holt had grief enough to drown in, and grief was not the same as murder. Cecily pressed the dry handkerchief to her mouth, and then he turned to Augustine Cross, and the room changed temperature. Augustine Cross did not deny it. That was the thing that caught the room off guard more than anything else, not the accusation, but the absence of any answer to it. He sat with his hands flat on the table, his ink-stained fingers spread, and looked at the candle in front of him rather than at Hayes, and after a long moment he said quietly, "She was going to destroy me." Hayes laid the promissory note on the table. He laid the folded paper with the poet's own handwriting beside it. He spoke calmly, as though narrating something that had already passed into history. Augustine had owed Queenie a debt for 2 years, a gambling loss she had covered to save his reputation and his freedom. The favor she had finally called in was monstrous. Use his literary connections, his standing in the Harlem Renaissance, to launder Caruso's money through a small press that would publish books no one would read and pay advances no one had earned. He had refused. She had told him refusal was not an option. They had met in her office at 9:30 alone, and the argument had become something else. He had not brought a weapon. He had not planned it. But there was a letter opener on her desk, silver, heavy, shaped like a key, and the rage inside him had been building for 2 years, and it found its shape in a single moment he could not take back. The playing card, he had found it on her desk, her own card from her own deck, the one she kept in the top drawer. He had placed it there because she had always called herself the Queen. It was, he said, the only honest thing he had done all evening. His voice broke on the word honest and did not recover. The police arrived at midnight, when the rain had softened to something almost gentle, barely a whisper against the windows of the Velvet Queen. They took Augustine Cross out the front door in handcuffs, and the August air that came in when the door opened was cooler than it had been all summer. Washed clean by the storm, the way air sometimes is after something has broken. Hayes stood at the bar and drank the bourbon that Earl poured him without being asked. Solomon Vance sat alone at the round table and stared at his hands. Cecily Holt had stopped crying, which was somehow worse than the crying had been. She sat on the edge of the stage, with her silver dress catching the last of the candlelight, and she looked at the empty microphone stand, and she did not sing. Della Monroe left without a word, stepping into the wet street and disappearing the way she always had, through the alleys and the dark between street lamps, back into the city that had never quite seen her. Vincent Caruso was the last to leave. At the door he paused, turned, and looked at Hayes with an expression that contained no particular emotion, only a kind of assessment, a recalculation. He put on his hat. He walked out into the Harlem night. The candles burned on. In the back office, the Queen of Spades still lay on the desk where Hayes had set it aside, face up, patient and black and waiting, the way secrets always wait, not for justice, but for the right person to finally pay attention. Outside, the rain slowed to nothing. The city breathed, and the Velvet Queen stood dark and quiet on 133rd Street, holding its grief the way old buildings always do, in its walls, in its wood, in the faint smell of candle smoke that would not clear for days.